The day I forgave my father. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Tell me your country and city in the comments, because it's always wonderful to see people from around the world coming together through stories. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with life lessons, hope, and unforgettable moments, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and become part of our growing community. Your support encourages us to continue sharing meaningful stories every week. My name is Michael Carter, and for more than 25 years, I carried a weight that no one could see. To the people around me, I looked like an ordinary man with a steady job, a quiet life, and very little to complain about. But inside, I held onto a pain that followed me everywhere. It was the pain of believing that my own father had chosen everything else over me. For years, I convinced myself that I would never forgive him. Every memory of my childhood reminded me of broken promises, unanswered questions, and words that were never spoken. I believed forgiveness was something only weak people offered. I thought holding on to my anger would somehow protect me from being hurt again. But I was wrong. The day I finally faced my father was the day I discovered that the truth can change a lifetime of misunderstanding. It became the day that transformed not only my relationship with him, but the person I had become. And that is where my story truly begins. The earliest memory I have of my father wasn't a happy one. It wasn't a birthday, a family vacation, or a game of catch in the backyard. It was the image of him walking out the front door before sunrise with a worn leather bag over his shoulder, promising he would be home in time for dinner. Most evenings, dinner came and went without him. As a child, I never understood why. I would sit by the living room window, watching every car that drove down our street. Each time headlights appeared, my heart filled with hope. Then the car would pass by, and the hope disappeared just as quickly. My mother always tried to comfort me. "Your father is working hard for this family," she would say with a gentle smile. At the time, those words meant very little to me. All I knew was that other fathers attended school plays, coached baseball games, and spent weekends with their children. Mine always seemed to be somewhere else. When I turned 10, my father promised he would come to my school's annual talent show. It wasn't a major event, but it meant everything to me. For weeks, I practiced playing an old guitar that my grandfather had given me. Every evening after school, I sat on the porch, repeating the same song until my fingers hurt. The night before the performance, my father placed his hand on my shoulder. "I'll be there," he said. "You promise?" I promise. I believed him. The next afternoon, I stood behind the stage curtain, holding my guitar tightly. I kept looking toward the audience, searching for his face. I saw my mother sitting in the third row. The seat beside her remained empty. The program began. Children walked onto the stage one after another. Parents clapped proudly, cameras flashed, and families smiled together. Then my name was called. I took a deep breath and walked into the spotlight. Before I played the first note, I looked toward the empty chair one last time. It was still empty. I finished the performance, but I don't remember hearing the applause. All I remember was walking off the stage with tears I tried desperately to hide. When we arrived home that evening, my father was sitting at the kitchen table. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "There was an emergency at work." I didn't answer. I walked straight past him and into my room. That was the first time I ignored my father. It wouldn't be the last. As the years passed, the distance between us grew wider. Conversations became shorter. Family dinners became quieter. Whenever he tried to ask about school, I answered with one or two words before leaving the room. Part of me wanted him to fight harder for our relationship. Another part had already convinced itself that he didn't care. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped expecting him to show up for anything important. If he did, it surprised me. If he didn't, it felt normal. My mother noticed the growing silence between us. One evening, she gently said, "Michael, your father loves you more than you know." I shook my head. "If he loved me," I replied, "he would have been there." She wanted to say something more, but instead, she simply lowered her eyes. Looking back now, I realized she was carrying a burden of her own. At the time, I couldn't see it. All I could see was my disappointment. I had no idea that my father's absences were hiding a truth he had protected for years, a truth that would eventually force me to question. everything I believed about him. After that talent show, something inside me changed. I stopped waiting for my father. Every promise he made sounded the same to me. Whether he said, "I'll be there," or "We'll spend the weekend together," I nodded without believing a single word. It was easier to expect nothing than to be disappointed again. My father noticed the distance growing between us. Some evenings he would knock gently on my bedroom door. "Mind if I come in?" I usually answered without looking up from my homework. "I'm busy." He would stand there for a moment before quietly saying, "All right, good night, son." The door would close and silence would fill the room again. At school, my friends often talked about fishing trips with their fathers, camping weekends and family vacations. I smiled and listened, but I rarely joined the conversation. I didn't want to explain why my father was almost never around. When I turned 16, I got my first part-time job at a neighborhood grocery store. I wanted my own money, but more than that, I wanted independence. I told myself that if I didn't depend on my father, he couldn't disappoint me anymore. On my first day of work, I walked home carrying my very first paycheck. My mother hugged me proudly. My father smiled and said, "Congratulations. I'm proud of you." Those words should have meant something. Instead, I simply replied, "Thanks." That single word ended the conversation. Weeks passed, and life settled into the same routine. My father left before sunrise and often returned long after dark. Some nights I heard him quietly talking with my mother in the kitchen after they thought I had gone to bed. Their voices were soft. Sometimes I heard my mother crying. Whenever I walked into the room, the conversation immediately stopped. I assumed they were arguing because of me. One Saturday morning, my father surprised me. "I took the day off," he said. "How about we drive out to the lake?" Just the two of us. Years earlier, I would have been excited. Now I wasn't. "I already have plans," I answered. "What plans?" "I'm meeting friends." It wasn't true. I had no plans at all. I simply didn't want to spend the day pretending everything was fine. I watched the disappointment cross his face before he quietly nodded. "Maybe another time." I shrugged. "Maybe." As he walked away, my mother looked at me with sadness. "Michael," she said softly, "one day you'll understand." "I don't think so." She didn't argue. She simply hugged my father as he picked up his jacket and left the house alone. That evening, I sat on the front porch by myself. Across the street, I watched a little boy learning to ride a bicycle, while his father ran beside him, cheering him on. I couldn't explain why, but seeing that simple moment hurt more than I expected. I wasn't jealous of the bicycle. I was jealous of the time, the attention, the encouragement, the memories they were creating together. That night, lying awake in bed, I made a decision. The moment I turned 18, I would leave home. I would build my own life, far away from the disappointment I had carried for so many years. What I didn't know was that my father had already made a life-changing decision of his own. Within a few weeks, an unexpected phone call would reveal a hidden chapter of his life, one that neither my mother nor I had ever fully understood. And it would begin to unravel the story I had believed since childhood. A few weeks passed after I decided to leave home the moment I turned 18. I kept my plans to myself. Every paycheck from the grocery store went into a small savings account, and I counted every dollar as if it were another step toward freedom. At home, nothing seemed to change. My father still left before sunrise. He still returned after dark. And we still spoke only when absolutely necessary. One rainy evening, I came home from work earlier than usual. As I stepped inside, I heard my parents talking quietly in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen, but my father's voice stopped me. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this from him." My mother's voice was filled with concern. "You promised." "I know. He deserves to hear it from you." I stood frozen in the hallway. For a moment, I wondered what they were talking about. Had my father lost his job? Were we having financial problems? Before I could hear anything else, the floor creaked beneath my feet. The conversation stopped immediately. A second later, my mother walked into the hallway with a forced smile. "You're home early?" "Yeah." She searched my face for a moment. "Everything okay at work?" "Everything's fine." She nodded, but I could tell she knew I had overheard something. Neither of us mentioned it again. The next morning, I left for school with more questions than answers. Over the following days, I paid closer attention. I noticed how tired my father always looked. Dark circles had formed beneath his eyes. Sometimes he rubbed his shoulders as though they carried an invisible weight. One evening, while taking out the trash, I saw him sitting alone on the back porch. He wasn't doing anything. He was simply staring into the darkness. For the first time in years, he looked older, much older. He noticed me standing there. "Michael." I nodded. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "Would you sit with me for a minute?" I almost said no, but something in his voice stopped me. I quietly sat down beside him. The silence felt awkward. "I know you think I wasn't there for you," he said softly. I stared straight ahead. "You missed a lot." "I know." "You broke a lot of promises." "I know." His answers surprised me. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't arguing. He was simply admitting it. After another long silence, he looked at me. "I hope one day you'll understand why." Before I could respond, his phone rang. He answered immediately. His expression changed. "I'll be there." He stood up quickly, grabbed his keys, and hurried toward his truck. As always, he left. I watched the taillights disappear down the street. Part of me wanted to believe he had another important reason. The other part whispered the same thought I had carried for years. He chose work over me. Again. The following afternoon, everything changed. While I was working at the grocery store, my manager walked over with a serious expression. "Michael," he said quietly, "your mother called." My heart began to race. "She said your father collapsed at work." For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. I dropped everything and ran out of the store without saying another word. As I raced toward the hospital, one question echoed through my mind. Had I spent all these years judging a man whose story I had never truly known? By the time I reached the hospital, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely push through the front doors. The bright lights, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the quiet conversations at the reception desk made everything feel unreal. I spotted my mother sitting alone in the waiting area. Her eyes were red from crying. The moment she saw me, she stood and wrapped her arms around me. "Is he—" I began, unable to finish the question. She gently shook her head.
"He's alive."
A breath I didn't realize I'd been holding escaped my chest. What happened? "The doctors believe it was caused by exhaustion. He collapsed at work this afternoon." I frowned. Exhaustion? He works a lot, but... My mother looked down at the floor. "More than you know." A doctor soon approached us. "Family of Mr. Carter." We both stood. "He's stable now," the doctor said. "His heart is strong. But his body has been under an incredible amount of stress for a long time. He needs rest, and he can't continue working the way he has been." After thanking the doctor, we were finally allowed to see him. I hesitated outside the hospital room. For years I had imagined confronting my father with all the anger I had carried inside me. Instead, I found myself afraid. When I stepped inside, I barely recognized him. The man who had always seemed so strong looked tired and fragile lying in the hospital bed. His eyes slowly opened. He smiled faintly. "Hey, son." I nodded. "How are you feeling?" "I've had better days." Neither of us knew what to say next. The silence felt heavy until my father quietly spoke. "I'm sorry you had to see me like this." I looked away. "You've scared Mom." "I know. You've scared me too." The words escaped before I could stop them. For the first time in years, my father looked directly into my eyes. "I'm sorry. Not just for today, for everything." Before I could respond, a nurse entered to check his medication. My mother gently touched my shoulder. "Come with me," she whispered. We walked into the quiet hospital hallway. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. That looked worn from years of being opened and closed. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she said. "What is it?" She handed it to me. "These are your father's pay stubs, medical bills, and loan papers." I looked through them one by one. There were bills from years earlier, receipts for surgeries, payments for expensive treatments, loan documents with nearly every paycheck committed to repayments. I stared at the papers in confusion. "I don't understand." My mother's voice trembled. "When you were 11 years old, I became seriously ill." I looked at her in disbelief. "I remember you being sick for a while." She nodded. What you didn't know was that the treatment lasted much longer than we ever told you. I turned another page. The medical expenses stretched across several years. He worked 2 jobs, she continued quietly. He left before sunrise and came home after dark because he refused to let us lose the house or stop your education. I couldn't speak. Every missed birthday, every empty chair, every broken promise. Suddenly they looked different. Not because he didn't care, but because he was desperately trying to keep our family together. As tears filled my eyes, I realized something that shook me to my core. For nearly half my life, I had judged my father without ever knowing the sacrifice he had made. And I still hadn't heard the whole story. The next morning, my father asked if I would bring him an old leather journal from the closet at home. He said that if I truly wanted to understand him, everything I needed to know was written inside its pages. The next morning, I drove home with my father's request echoing in my mind. If you truly want to understand me, everything you need to know is written inside that journal. Those words stayed with me the entire drive. The house felt unusually quiet without him. For years, I had associated the place with rushed mornings and late-night arrivals. Now every room seemed frozen in time. I walked into my parents' bedroom and opened the old wooden closet. On the top shelf, behind a stack of neatly folded blankets, sat a worn leather journal covered in a thin layer of dust. I carefully picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. Inside the front cover, my father had written just one sentence. "For my son, when he is finally ready to know the truth." My hands trembled as I turned the first page. The earliest entries were written just before I was born. "My greatest dream is to become the kind of father my son will always be proud of." I stopped reading for a moment. That single sentence shattered the image I had carried for years. I had always believed my father never cared. Yet here he was, years before I could even speak, writing about the father he hoped to become. I continued reading. The journal described the day I was born. He wrote about holding me for the first time. He described counting my tiny fingers, hearing my first cry, and promising himself that I would never have to struggle the way he had growing up. Then the pages became more difficult. A few years later, he wrote about my mother's illness. The doctor explained the treatment would be expensive. I smiled in front of my family, but inside I was terrified. I didn't know how I would pay for everything, but I knew one thing. Michael would never lose his home because I gave up. Another page followed. I accepted a second job today. It means I'll miss dinner most nights. My son will probably think I don't want to spend time with him. That thought hurts more than the long hours. I closed my eyes. Every painful memory I had carried suddenly collided with a truth I had never imagined. He had known exactly how I would feel, and he had accepted that pain because protecting our family mattered more to him than protecting his own reputation. Tears rolled down my face as I turned another page. There was an entry about my school talent show. I promised Michael I would be there. I believed I could make it. An hour before the performance, I received a call from the hospital. His mother's condition suddenly became worse. I sat beside her bed praying she would recover. I've never hated myself more than I did tonight. I know I broke my son's heart. The words became blurry through my tears. For years, I had remembered only the empty chair. I had never imagined where my father actually was. As I continued reading, I found a folded photograph tucked between 2 pages. It showed my father standing outside the hospital after a long night. His work clothes were dirty. His face looked exhausted. But he was smiling because my mother had recovered enough to come home. On the back of the photograph he had written, "One day I hope my son understands why I wasn't in the audience." I held the photograph tightly. For the first time in my life I wasn't angry. I was heartbroken. Not because of what I had lost, but because of everything my father had carried alone. I closed the journal and looked around the quiet house. The man I thought I knew had been fighting battles in silence for years. As I returned to the hospital that afternoon with the journal in my hands, I knew I had only one question left. Could my father ever forgive me for the years I had spent believing the worst about him? As I walked through the hospital doors with the leather journal tucked under my arm, I felt like a different person than the one who had left that morning. For years I had carried anger in my heart. Now that anger had been replaced by questions, regret, and a deep sadness, I paused outside my father's room. For a moment I wondered whether I was ready for this conversation. Then I quietly knocked. "Come in," my father called. He looked up as I entered and immediately noticed the journal in my hands. "So," he said softly, "you read it." I nodded. "I did." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down. "I thought you didn't care about me," I admitted. He lowered his eyes. "I know. I spent years believing you always chose work over your family." A faint smile crossed his face, but it was filled with sadness. If only life had been that simple. I looked at him, trying to hold back my emotions. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because you were a child." He paused for a moment. "I didn't want you worrying about hospital bills, loans, or your mother's health. I wanted you to enjoy your childhood even if it meant you misunderstood me." I shook my head. "But I blamed you." "I know." "And I pushed you away." "I know." Every answer he gave carried the same quiet understanding. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, only compassion. I looked down at the journal resting in my lap. "There were so many times I ignored you." He smiled gently. "But you're here now." His words broke something inside me. Tears filled my eyes. "I'm sorry." The room became completely silent. For the first time since I was a little boy, I reached over and held my father's hand. "I'm so sorry for all the years I spent hating you." He squeezed my hand gently. "You never hated me." I looked at him in surprise. "You were hurting." A few tears rolled down his cheeks. "And every father hopes that one day his child will understand." I couldn't stop crying. Neither could he. After several minutes, he quietly said, "Do you remember teaching yourself to ride that old bicycle?" I smiled through my tears. "I thought I did it alone." He chuckled softly. "You did most of it." I looked at him curiously. "I used to come home during my lunch break." "What?" "I parked my truck around the corner so you wouldn't see me." I frowned.
Why?
"You were determined to learn without help." He laughed quietly. So I watched from a distance. "Every time you fell, I wanted to run over and pick you up. But I knew you'd be proudest if you got back up by yourself." I stared at him in disbelief. "You were there?" He nodded. "More often than you ever realized." The memories rushed back. The feeling that someone had been watching. The strange comfort I couldn't explain. It had been him all along. That afternoon we talked longer than we ever had before. He shared stories from my childhood that I had forgotten. I shared the loneliness I had carried for years. Neither of us tried to erase the past. Instead, we finally understood it. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, my father looked at me with a peaceful smile. "There is one more thing I've wanted to tell you for a very long time." I leaned forward. "What is it?" He looked out the window for a moment before speaking. "The answer might change the way you remember your entire childhood." At that moment, I realized our conversation wasn't over. The greatest truth was still waiting to be revealed. I leaned forward in my chair, unable to take my eyes off my father. "The answer might change the way you remember your entire childhood." Those words echoed in my mind. For years, I had believed I knew every important memory from my childhood. I thought I understood why my father had missed birthdays, school events, and family dinners. But now I realized I had only seen one side of the story. My father took a slow breath. "Do you remember the summer when you were 12? I nodded. "That was the year I broke my arm riding my bicycle." He smiled gently. "Do you remember what happened after that?" "I remember waking up in the hospital. Mom was sitting beside me." He nodded. "But you don't remember who carried you there?" I frowned. "No, it was me." I looked at him surprised. "You had just finished work when one of your friends came running to tell me you'd been hurt. I didn't wait for an ambulance. I picked you up and drove you to the hospital myself." I searched my memory, but everything after the accident was a blur. "I stayed beside your bed all night," he continued. "The next morning I left for work before you woke up, because I couldn't afford to lose another day's pay." I lowered my eyes. "So you were there?" "I was." He reached into the drawer beside his hospital bed and pulled out a small envelope. "I've kept these for years." Inside were old photographs. The first showed me sleeping in a hospital bed with my arm in a cast. Sitting beside me was my father. He looked exhausted, still wearing his work clothes, but his hand rested gently on my shoulder. The second photograph showed him smiling as I slept peacefully. I had never seen those pictures before. Tears blurred my vision. I thought Mom was the only one there. He smiled softly.
She took the photographs.
I carefully placed them back into the envelope. "There are more things you don't remember," he said. He told me about rainy evenings, when he quietly repaired my broken toys after I had gone to bed. He told me how he secretly saved money for months to buy the guitar my grandfather eventually gave me, asking Grandpa to present it as a gift because he knew I was upset with him. He told me about the nights he stood outside my bedroom door, listening just to make sure I was sleeping peacefully before leaving for his second job. Every story revealed another act of love I had never noticed. "I wasn't perfect," he said quietly. "I made mistakes." I shook my head. "We all do." He smiled. "But loving you was never one of them." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Just then, my mother entered the room carrying a small paper bag. She stopped when she saw us smiling. "I haven't seen the two of you look at each other like that in years," she said. I stood and hugged her. "I'm sorry, Mom." She looked surprised. "For what?" "For making you carry this secret alone." She gently placed her hand on my cheek. "I prayed every day that this moment would come." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about old family memories, laughing over stories that had once been forgotten. For the first time in many years, the room felt filled with warmth instead of silence. As visiting hours came to an end, my father looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "Michael," he said, "when I leave this hospital, there's one place I'd like us to visit together." "Where?" He smiled. "The place where everything between us first began to fall apart." I nodded without hesitation. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that journey would complete the healing that had finally begun, and it would lead us to the day I had been searching for my entire life, the day I truly forgave my father. A week later, my father was finally discharged from the hospital. The doctor reminded him to take things slowly, get plenty of rest, and avoid working long hours for a while. For the first time in my life, I was the one reminding him to follow instructions. "You've spent enough years taking care of everyone else," I said with a smile. "Now let someone take care of you." He laughed quietly. "I'll do my best." As we drove away from the hospital, my father looked out the window without saying much. I could tell he was thinking about something important. Nearly an hour later, we turned onto a familiar road. At first, I couldn't understand why it seemed so familiar. Then I saw it. My old elementary school. The building looked smaller than I remembered, but the large oak tree near the entrance was still standing exactly where it had always been. My father parked the truck. "This is where I wanted to come." We slowly walked across the empty playground. Children had already gone home for the day, and the only sounds were birds singing in the trees and the gentle breeze moving through the swings. When we reached the school auditorium, my father stopped. "This was the place." I looked at him. "The talent show." He nodded. For years, I had avoided thinking about that afternoon. I remembered standing on the stage, searching for my father in the crowd. I remembered the empty chair. "I've replayed that day thousands of times," I admitted. "So have I," he replied. He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully unfolded a yellowed piece of paper. It was my talent show program. The edges were worn, but my name was still clearly printed on it. "I kept this all these years," he said. "You still have it?" "I never threw it away." He smiled sadly. "I carried it with me because it reminded me of the promise I couldn't keep." I looked at the old paper in my hands. JK. For so many years I had believed that day proved I wasn't important to him. Now I understood that it had hurt him just as deeply. "I wish I could go back," he whispered. "So do I." We stood quietly for several moments. Finally, I broke the silence. "If you could go back, what would you tell that little boy standing on the stage?" He looked toward the empty auditorium doors. "I'd tell him that his father loved him more than words could ever explain." His voice trembled. "And I'd ask him to wait just a little longer." Tears filled my eyes. "I think he'd believe you." We walked onto the old stage together. I stood in the same place where I had stood as a frightened 10-year-old. Looking out at the empty rows of seats, I imagined the audience once again. But this time, I imagined something different. Instead of focusing on the empty chair, I pictured my father sitting beside my mother's hospital bed, praying she would survive. For the first time, the memory no longer filled me with anger. It filled me with understanding. As we left the school, my father placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you for coming here with me." I smiled. "No." I looked him in the eyes. "Thank you for finally bringing me back." On the drive home, neither of us spoke very much. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer filled with hurt. It was filled with peace. As we turned onto our street, my father quietly said, "There's one more thing I've wanted to do before this chapter of our lives is over." I glanced at him. "What is it?" He smiled warmly. "I'd like to spend one whole day with my son. No work, no interruptions, no missed promises. Just the two of us." Without hesitation, I nodded. I had waited for that day since I was a little boy. This time I knew he would be there. The following Saturday arrived with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement. As a child, I had often waited for weekends, hoping my father and I would finally spend time together. Most of those weekends ended with a phone call from work or an unexpected emergency. Eventually, I stopped hoping. But this Saturday was different. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, I heard a knock on my bedroom door. "Good morning," my father said with a smile. "Are you ready?" I looked at the clock and laughed. "You actually beat me. I told you this day would be different." We climbed into his old pickup truck and started, driving without any particular destination. The windows were down, fresh morning air filled the cab, and for the first time, I could remember neither of us was in a hurry. "Where are we going?" I asked. He smiled. "I thought we'd let the road decide." We stopped at a small diner just outside town, where my father used to eat breakfast years ago. The owner looked up from behind the counter and immediately recognized him. "Well, if it isn't David Carter," he said with a wide grin. "It's been a long time." "It has." The owner looked at me. "And this must be Michael." I nodded. "It's nice to meet you." The man laughed softly. "I've known about you for years." I looked at my father in surprise. "You have?" The owner poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down for a moment. "Your father talked about you every single time he came in here." I frowned. "He did?" "My boy loves music," he'd say. "He's growing up too fast. One day he'll do great things." I slowly turned toward my father. "You never told me that." He smiled modestly. "I didn't think I needed to." As we left the diner, I realized something painful. While I had spent years telling people my father wasn't around, he had been telling strangers how proud he was of me. The realization stayed with me for the rest of the morning. We spent the afternoon driving through quiet country roads. At one point, my father pulled the truck over beside a peaceful lake. "We used to come here before you were old enough to remember," he said. We sat on an old wooden dock with our fishing poles resting quietly in the water. Neither of us cared whether we caught anything. The conversation mattered more. "I owe you another apology," I said. He looked at me. "For judging you." He gently shook his head. "We both lost years we'll never get back. I wish I'd listened sooner." "So do I." He smiled kindly. "But we can't change yesterday." I nodded. "No, we can only decide what we'll do with today." Those words settled deep in my heart. As the sun began to set across the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and orange, I realized something had changed inside me. The anger I had carried for more than 20 years was gone. There was no bitterness left, no resentment, only gratitude. For the first time since I was a child, I looked at my father without seeing. The man who had missed important moments. I saw the man who had sacrificed everything to give his family a better life. On the drive home, I quietly said the words I had been carrying in my heart all day. "Dad." He glanced at me. "I forgive you." He smiled, but tears filled his eyes. "I've already forgiven myself because today, my son came back to me." As we pulled into the driveway, I realized the hardest part of our journey was over. The years of misunderstanding had finally come to an end. Now all that remained was to build new memories together and discover that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it gives. The future a chance to become something better. After that Saturday together, life didn't suddenly become perfect. The past was still there. The missed birthdays still happened. The empty chair at my talent show would always be part of my childhood. But something had changed. Those memories no longer controlled me. Instead of seeing only disappointment, I could finally see the love that had been hidden behind every sacrifice. Over the next few months, my father kept his promise. Every Sunday belonged to our family. Sometimes we worked together in the backyard, repairing old fences or planting flowers with my mother. Other weekends we drove through the countryside, stopping at small diners and talking for hours. We weren't trying to make up for 20 years in a single afternoon. We were simply making the most of the time we had now. One evening, while we were organizing boxes in the garage, I found an old cardboard container covered with dust. "What's in this one?" I asked.
My father smiled.
"I haven't opened that in years." Inside were dozens of memories. There were newspaper clippings from my high school graduation, certificates from school competitions, childhood drawings I had forgotten about, and photographs from nearly every stage of my life. I stared at them in disbelief. "You kept all of these?" "Every single one." I picked up a drawing I had made when I was 7 years old. The paper was faded, and the colors had begun to disappear. At the bottom, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "My hero." I looked at my father. "I drew this for you." "I know. You still have it." He smiled. "I never planned to throw it away." I couldn't hold back my emotions. For years I believed my father hadn't cared about the little moments. Now I was holding proof that he had quietly treasured every one of them. A few weeks later, our family gathered for my mother's birthday. For the first time in many years, the house was filled with laughter instead of silence. Neighbors stopped by, relatives shared old stories, and the dining table was surrounded by smiling faces. As everyone enjoyed dessert, my mother gently tapped her glass. "I want to say something." The room grew quiet. She looked first at my father, then at me. "For many years I prayed for only one gift." She paused, smiling through tears. "Not money, not a bigger house, not an easier life." She reached out and held both of our hands. "I prayed that the two people I loved most would find their way back to each other." No one spoke. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. My father quietly squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry for the years we lost." I smiled. "We can't change them." "No, but we can honor them by never wasting another day." That evening, after everyone had gone home, my father and I sat on the front porch watching the stars appear one by one. "You know," he said with a quiet laugh, "when you were little, you always asked me impossible questions." "Like what?" "How many stars are in the sky? Or where does the wind go when it stops blowing?" I laughed. "I really asked those?" "You did." We both smiled. Then his expression became thoughtful. "I have one last lesson I'd like to share with you." I turned toward him. He looked up at the night sky before speaking. "Life will always give you reasons to hold on to anger." He paused. "But if you carry anger for too long, it becomes heavier than the pain that created it." His words settled deeply into my heart. At that moment, I understood that forgiveness hadn't only changed my relationship with my father, it had changed the kind of man I wanted to become. And although our story was almost complete, there was one final chapter left to write, one that would show me the true meaning of family, love, and the legacy a father leaves behind. The seasons continued to change, just as they always had. Spring gave way to summer. Summer slowly turned into autumn. The trees outside our home changed from bright green to shades of gold and crimson, reminding me that life never stands still. It keeps moving forward whether we're ready or not. My father followed the doctor's advice and finally slowed down. For the first time in decades, he wasn't chasing overtime or working through every weekend. Instead, he spent his mornings reading on the front porch, helping my mother in the garden, and waiting for me to stop by after work. Those simple moments became the greatest gifts we could have asked for. One Saturday afternoon, we decided to clean out the old attic together. Dust covered everything, and every box seemed to hold another forgotten memory. As we sorted through them, my father pulled out a small wooden box. "I've been saving this for you," he said. I opened it carefully. Inside was the old wristwatch he had worn almost every day while I was growing up. The leather strap was worn, and the glass had a few scratches, but it still worked perfectly. "You always wore this," I said. He smiled. "It reminded me that every minute mattered." He gently placed it in my hand. "I want you to have it now. I can't take this." "Yes, you can." He looked at me with the same calm expression I had come to know so well. "A watch doesn't stop time. It simply reminds us not to waste it." I fastened it around my wrist. It fit perfectly. Weeks later, our family gathered once again, this time for a community picnic in the local park. Children laughed as they played. Neighbors shared homemade meals, and old friends reunited after years apart. Someone suggested taking a family photograph. As everyone gathered together, I stood beside my father. The photographer smiled. "Everyone ready?" Just before the picture was taken, my father quietly whispered, "I'm proud of the man you've become." I felt my throat tighten. "Everything good in me began with you," I answered. The camera captured the moment forever. A few months later, I framed that photograph and placed it on the living room wall. Whenever I looked at it, I no longer remembered years of silence. I remembered the day we chose to begin again. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I asked my father a question that had been on my heart for a long time. "After everything that happened, did you ever think we'd have a relationship like this again?" He smiled as he watched the sun disappear behind the hills. I never stopped hoping. Those 4 words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Hope. It had carried my father through long work days, sleepless nights, financial struggles, and years of misunderstanding. And in the end, hope had brought our family back together. Today, whenever I meet someone carrying anger toward a parent, I don't tell them what they should do. Instead, I simply share my story. I tell them that every family has chapters filled with joy and chapters filled with pain. Sometimes we know the whole story. Sometimes we only know the part that hurt us. The day I forgave my father wasn't the day the past disappeared. It was the day I stopped allowing the past to decide my future. I learned that forgiveness doesn't erase mistakes, nor does it pretend painful memories never happened. Forgiveness gives us the courage to understand, the strength to heal, and the chance to love again. As I looked at my father's old watch resting on my wrist, I realized the greatest inheritance he had ever given me wasn't money, possessions, or success. It was his example of quiet sacrifice, unwavering love, and the belief that no relationship is beyond hope when people are willing to listen, understand, and begin again. That is the legacy I now carry forward, and it is the one I hope will continue through every generation that follows.